Satchidananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We have more or less reached the end of Book 1, Samadhi Pada of the Yoga Sutras. We'll be finishing the discussion of Book 1 today. We'll very briefly start with 1.48 and then discuss 49, 50, and 51 and conclude the book. There's a lot to discuss. It's very interesting. And a heads up on the next class. Next Thursday, March 13th, 7:30 p.m. The assignment is to read Yoga Sutras 2.1 to 2.3. So the next book, Sadhana Pada. This is the second book of the Yoga Sutras, focused on spiritual practice, which is very practical for us. And read Bryant's commentary on the same, on 2.1 to 2.3, which are pages 169 to 176. So only about 8 pages. Okay. I've got a lot written on the board here. If you recall from our last couple classes, we've been discussing the different stages of Asamprajnata Samadhi. Okay? It's a high stage of Samadhi, but it's not the highest. And the sixth and final stage is called Nirvichara Samadhi, which we discussed last time. And it's discussed in 1.47 of the Yoga Sutras. Okay. Now, on Bryant's interpretation, and he seems plausible to me, he's asking, what is the connection between 1.47 and the next sutra, 1.48? So, let's first read 1.48. Please repeat after me. Rtambhara Tatra Prajna. In that state, there is truth-bearing wisdom. Rtambhara, the translation would be truth-bearing wisdom. In that state. Which state? Tatra. The state referred to in the previous sutra, 1.47, which is this final stage of Asamprajnata Samadhi called Nirvichara Samadhi. So, as far as I can tell, maybe you have a different take on this, but it seems like Bryant is more or less equating Nirvichara Samadhi, the final stage of Asamprajnata Samadhi, with Rtambhara Prajna, this truth-bearing wisdom. It's a kind of segue from Asamprajnata Samadhi into the highest stage of Samadhi, which is Asamprajnata Samadhi. Okay? Now, what's so special about this Rtambhara Prajna? That's discussed in the next sutra. So please repeat after me, 1.49. Shruta Anumana Pragyabhyam Anya Vishaya Vishesha Arthatvat. Okay. It, meaning seedless samadhi, so this is now it's starting to talk about the highest stage of samadhi. Okay. But actually, this is also kind of misleading, I think. I think it's not just referring to seedless samadhi. I think it's referring also probably to Asamprajnata Samadhi. We can talk about that. So I'm not sure that I want to put a question mark over the square brackets here. I think it encompasses the stages of Asamprajnata Samadhi and Asamprajnata Samadhi. But we'll see. Let's see as we read his commentary how he substantiates that. Because he's still discussing Rtambhara Prajna, which is not yet Asamprajnata Samadhi. Okay, so it has a different focus from that of inference and sacred scripture. Inference, the Sanskrit term for inference is anumana, so reasoning. And shruta refers to shruti, the sacred scripture, like the Yoga Sutra itself and the Vedas. Why? Because it has the particularity of things as its object. Particularity here is vishesha. The term is vishesha. Okay, and on Bryant's understanding, and he's basing his commentary on Vyasa, the first major commentator, that this vishesha, this particularity, has a technical meaning. Okay, and so he's going to explain that, and then I'm going to discuss read out to you Swami Vivekananda's commentary on the same sutra, because he has, I think, a slightly different take on it, which in some ways I think is more practical from a spiritual standpoint. We'll talk about it. Okay, so let's begin with the with his comment, Bryant's commentary on 1.49. So this is page 159. The term vishesha, particularity or specificity, as discussed in 1.7, is typically associated with the schools of Nyaya and Vaisheshika. These are two other schools of Indian philosophy, which are known for their logical reasoning, basically. In the metaphysical system of these schools, all of manifest reality can be ultimately broken down to 7 categories, 2 of which are Vishesha, particularity, and Samanya, generality. Vishesha on the one hand and Samanya on the other, okay? Vishesha is best understood in contrast to Samanya, which refers to the general category of an object. Let us consider a cow or a pot. The word cow refers to a generic category of bovine creature with udders and horns who gives milk and goes moo. And pot to a roundish container, usually made of clay, at least in India, that holds liquids or other substances. Although there are millions of cows in the world, and each and every one is distinct, individual, and unique in some way, the term cow does not particularize or distinguish one cow from another. It is a general term that refers to an entire category of creatures. Likewise with pot. Okay, that's obvious. And then Vishesha, by contrast, is what particularizes ultimate entities from each other. One atom from another. The character an atom has that makes it a unique, specific individual, distinct from any other atom. Okay, so philosophers use these two terms that are, I think, similar to what Vishesha and Samanya, what they mean. Type versus token. So a type is all cows in the world. A token is a specific cow. You know, I guess we used to have cows in our Gretz Center. I don't know if we still, I think we still do actually. So those particular cows are tokens of cows. And the type of cow is all cows in general, right? So Vishesha corresponds to a token, a specific instance of something, whether it's a cow or a chair or a human being, okay? And Samanya is the general category, the general type. Okay, why is any of this relevant? He goes on to explain. Sounds kind of boring. Okay, it might be boring, but anyway, we'll see why it's relevant. Okay, next paragraph, 160. Vyasa says that the 3 forms of knowledge accepted by yoga in 1.7, agama, meaning scripture, the sacred scripture, referred to here as shruta, anumana, logic or inference, and conventional pratyaksha, sense perception, just ordinary sense perception of things in the world, are all limited because they cannot provide information about particulars or specifics. They don't give us information about vishesha, the unique specificity or particularity of each object, okay? Scripture and other types of verbal authority are dependent on words, and words like cow can only point to the cow as a member of a general class of things. So even the scriptures, the great scriptures, can't actually teach you anything about the specificity of particular items or realities. It can only talk about types, okay? And then he goes on in the next paragraph to explain why inference also falls short in that regard. He says, inference also deals only with generalities. The standard Indic example of inference is whenever there is smoke, there is fire. Yet the statement gives us no information about any specific fire. So you can only make generalizations using reasoning about types of things rather than of specific things. Okay. But of these 3, right? So conventional perception, like ordinary sense perception, scripture, and inference. The toughest one to explain within this framework would be ordinary sense perception, because when I see a chair, I'm not just seeing a generic chair, I'm actually seeing a specific chair, right? And I might be able to see what distinguishes that particular chair from this chair, and so on. So doesn't at least conventional sense perception give me a knowledge of specificity that maybe scripture and that inference doesn't give me? So Bryant addresses that in the same paragraph, page 160. He says, as for empirical sense perception, pratyaksha, it is true, say the commentators, that when we look at a particular cow or pot, we might be able to pick up on some characteristic that distinguishes the cow or pot in front of us from other cows and pots. Perhaps this cow has an unusual skin color or the pot an odd shape. But conventional sense perception, says Vyasa, cannot provide us information about the very specific or subtle nature of an object, its atomic composition, for example, or about distant or hidden objects beyond the range of the senses. So this is what's missing from conventional sense perception, these 2 things. Number one of the things that makes a particular thing so unique is its specific atomic composition. which we can't see with the naked eye. Okay? But in these very special states of samadhi, the yogi can actually see the atoms of which items are composed. So that would fall under vishesha, the specificity of the object. And then also, ordinary sense perception, through ordinary sense perception, we can't learn about very far away objects, which are beyond the range of our human vision, or hidden objects that are invisible to our ordinary sense perception. Okay? So those also fall under vishesha, the specificity of things that get lost in conventional sense perception. Huh? If they're extremely small, like microscopic kinds of things as well, yeah, exactly. I mean, to the point of atoms, right? That would be the smallest kind of item. Okay, so then he says, next paragraph, only through the clear, unobstructed insight of samadhi can one fully grasp the vishesha, particularity of an object, its subtle substructure of distinct atoms and essences. And here, he's saying samadhi. He's not saying asamprajnata samadhi. I think it's all types of samadhi. I think he's including all the different stages of samprajnata samadhi and asamprajnata samadhi. And that's why I think that it's a little strange that he glosses the it in 1.49 as only seedless samadhi, because I think it includes sabija samadhi as well, samprajnata samadhi. That's my take. Unless you guys disagree with me, you can make a case for otherwise. But okay. So then he says, Patanjali will later claim that the yogi can tell the difference between two identical items, since although they appear identical to normal perception, let's imagine like two glasses which look exactly the same to ordinary perception. The atoms comprising them are different, and it is these that the yogi can perceive. So this is quite interesting. He can actually see the atoms making up glass 1 and glass 2, and he recognizes that the two glasses are actually different in that sense. They're both glasses, so they both fall under the same samanya, the general category of glass. But they're actually distinct glasses, and he can see it because he can see them at the atomic level. It gets kind of weird, but without a microscope. Okay. Then he says, Bryant says, we must keep in mind that the yogic tradition claims one can actually perceive these essences, not merely theorize their existence through the undeviatingly concentrated focus of mind in the higher stages of samadhi. Again, he says higher stages of samadhi. I think he's including the samprajnata samadhi and asamprajnata samadhi. This perception then is actually a form of pratyaksha. Okay, but not that of conventional sense perception. Schools like yoga, Vedanta, Nyaya, they distinguish two forms of pratyaksha. I think we talked about this in a previous class. Pratyaksha just means perception. But there's sense perception, the perception using the five senses, and then there's supersensory perception. And that goes by different names. Yoga ja pratyaksha, it's the perception born of yoga. So it's yogic perception, it's a supersensuous perception. And so the yoga school accepts both. And so now he's talking about yogic or yoga ja perception. This yoga ja pratyaksha is not conventional sense perception. Yogic pratyaksha transcends normal sense-based perception. It is para pratyaksha, higher, supreme, supernormal perception. Okay. Now, another crucial thing. Still, you might be wondering, as I was reading this, I'm still wondering, like, who cares? And how is any of this relevant to spiritual life? Why does it help me spiritually to know the atomic composition of glass 1 versus glass 2? So finally, Bryant gets to this in the next paragraph. Okay. He says, toward the end of that paragraph, Patanjali is here clearly asserting that samadhi surpasses the ability of scripture and inference in their ability to fully experience an object at its subtlest level, rather than understanding it in an indirect, generic, and mediated sort of way. So Sri Ramakrishna will use the example of an almanac. He says, if you squeeze, no matter how hard you squeeze an almanac, not one drop will come out of it, right? Okay, so he's likening that to scripture. So finally, we need spiritual practice and then culminating in spiritual realization, spiritual experience, to actually gain knowledge. And ultimately, says Vyasa, this is the crucial thing, and ultimately, says Vyasa, it is only through samadhi that one can grasp the distinct particularity of the soul itself. This is the spiritual importance of this whole thing. Okay, because what does vishesha mean? Vishesha means specificity or particularity, the uniqueness. We don't particularly care as spiritual aspirants, at least most of us don't care about understanding or knowing the atomic composition of a glass. But we do care about knowing the uniqueness, the specificity, the particularity of our own soul, the vishesha of our purusha, Okay? We can't know the Purusha without gaining these very high states of samadhi. So that's the basic idea. This is a very kind of indirect technical explanation of the whole thing. Swami Vivekananda gives a very forceful and I think kind of more direct way of explaining the same sutra, so I thought I would share it with you. So first of all, his translation is the knowledge that is gained from testimony and inference. Testimony means scriptural testimony. And inference is about common objects. That from the samadhi just mentioned is of a much higher order. And notice here, Swamiji is also saying from the samadhi just mentioned. That's going back to the highest stage of sampragnata samadhi, which is equivalent to Rtambhara Prajna. So again, I wonder whether Brian has just made a mistake, or I don't know. But yeah, can you give him the mic? 1 second.
Just in that sutra, it says it seedless samadhi, and then it says because it, referring to seedless samadhi, has a particularity of things as its object. So that doesn't, to me, it doesn't make obvious sense, because seedless would be without any seed, and then they're saying a particularity of things as its object that has seeds.
Right, and
so
because as its object.
This is like, what?
Yeah, it's a little strange, because it still seems to imply subject-object duality.
Yeah.
And, that's why, I'm a little surprised. I don't know. I mean, I agree with you. Well, maybe I also don't see it, because I think that it should include both. I mean, I think it should encompass both. All the stages of sampragnata samadhi and asamprajnata samadhi. That's my feeling. And we'll get to, in the last sutra of this book, 1.51, we'll get to how you can interpret asamprajnata samadhi also as realizing the vishesha of the soul, but through identity, basically. It's like Sri Ramakrishna says, the state of nirvikalpa samadhi, he says, is like when a salt doll goes to measure the depth of the ocean and it melts into the ocean. So you become one with that unique soul that you are in your deepest essence. Something along those lines. Okay? Okay, so now, I think that's enough for 1.49. Oh, I was reading Swamiji, so let me continue reading Swamiji. So then Swamiji says, that from the samadhi just mentioned is of a much higher order, being able to penetrate where inference and testimony cannot go. So notice how he's rendering this. He's not going into the technical explanation of Vishesha. He's saying that he's interpreting Vishesha here as the knowledge itself produced from samadhi, generated from samadhi, is of a much higher order than the knowledge we get from perceiving ordinary objects. Okay, in what sense higher order? He explains that. The idea is that we have to get our knowledge of ordinary objects by direct perception and by inference therefrom and from testimony of people who are competent. Okay, and then he says, we can read all the Vedas and yet will not realize anything. But when we practice their teachings, then we attain to that state which realizes what the scriptures say, which penetrates where neither reason nor perception nor inference can go, and where the testimony of others cannot avail. This is what is meant by the aphorism. And then he says, realization is real religion. All the rest is only preparation. Hearing lectures or reading books or reasoning is merely preparing the ground. It is not religion. Intellectual assent and dissent are not religion. The central idea of the yogis is that just as we come in direct contact with objects of the senses, so religion even can be directly perceived in a far more intense sense. The truths of religion as God and soul cannot be perceived by the external senses. I cannot see God with my eyes, nor can I touch him with my hands. And we also know that neither can we reason beyond the senses. Then he makes an interesting point. He says, reason leaves us at a point quite indecisive. We may reason all our lives, as the world has been doing for thousands of years, and the result is that we find we are incompetent to prove or disprove the facts of religion. What we perceive directly, we take as a basis. And upon that basis, we reason. So it is obvious that reasoning has to run within these bounds of perception. It can never go beyond. The whole scope of realization, therefore, is beyond sense perception. The yogis say that man can go beyond his direct sense perception and beyond his reason also. Man has in him the faculty, the power of transcending his intellect even, a power which is in every being, every creature. By the practice of yoga, that power is aroused, and then man transcends the ordinary limits of reason and directly perceives things which are beyond all reason. So I like this Swamiji's interpretation of the sutra. The basic idea is that spiritual experience gives us knowledge of a far higher order than anything that ordinary perception can give us, that anything even that the scriptures can give us, and anything that we can get through reasoning. And you should remember that he was an undergraduate philosophy major at Scottish Church College in Kolkata during British colonial times. So a lot of his teachers, I think most of them, possibly all of them, were Western, Scottish, British. And he learned Western philosophy, a lot of Western philosophy. One of those Western philosophers he studied was Kant, the great German philosopher, Immanuel Kant. And Kant basically argued that through reasoning, we can never know God. And we can never know whether we're an eternal soul separate from our physical bodies. Reasoning will result ultimately in agnosticism. Rationally speaking, because he said, he says there are good rational arguments in favor of God's existence. There are good arguments against God's existence. There are good arguments in favor of an eternal soul. There are good arguments against the existence of an eternal soul. You can borrow from Buddhist schools, for instance, to argue against the eternal soul. Right? And he says it ends in a kind of stalemate, a rational stalemate. So it ends in a kind of agnosticism. That's what he says. And so Kant, there's a famous statement he makes in the preface to his masterpiece, Critique of Pure Reason. He says, I've had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. I've had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. He says, because we can't know God, we have to have faith in God. Because we can't know that we're an eternal soul, we should have faith. So he ends with faith, but that's kind of problematic, right? But in Vedanta says, there is a faculty of knowledge beyond rational knowledge, right? Beyond inference. That's called supersensuous knowledge. Kant denied the possibility of supersensuous knowledge, at least in his mature period. Early on, he believed in it, but then he repudiated that idea. Okay, so I think Swamiji has these things in mind, at least people like Kant. And I think he agrees with Kant that through reasoning alone, you'll end up with a kind of agnosticism. You can't know either way whether God exists or whether you have eternal souls. Okay, you have to go beyond. You have to transcend the realm of reasoning, of rationality, to the supra-rational level of spiritual experience. That's the whole thrust of 1.49. Okay. Okay. Now we get to the really interesting interpretive issues, starting with 1.50. So please repeat after me. 2 more sutras in this book, so we'll look at them carefully. Please repeat after me. 1.50. Tajjaha samskaraha Āraṇya samskara pratibandhi. Okay, the samskaras born out of that, referring back to the previous sutra or previous 2 sutras. So he glosses this, I think, correctly as that truth-bearing wisdom. The samskaras born out of that truth-bearing wisdom, Rtambhara Prajna, obstruct other samskaras from emerging. Okay? Āraṇya samskara, pratibandhi. Now, let's look at the commentary, and then I want you to think for yourselves about this, because I think that Bryant is confusing and possibly even making a mistake here. But I want your take on this. Okay, so let's read. Patanjali here states that the truth-bearing wisdom, Rtambhara Jnana of 1.48, produces a certain type of samskara of its own. So this highest stage of Samprajnata Samadhi, called Rtambhara Prajna, produces its own samskaras. Okay, what kind of samskaras? Evidently, these pratibandhi or blocking samskaras are effectively the virama pratyaya, the thought of terminating all thoughts of 1.18. Sounds paradoxical. Such truth-bearing wisdom samskaras, Vyasa hastens to add, do not provoke the mind into vritti activity or activate as thought or in any way agitate the chitta, which would be counterproductive to the goal of yoga. So not all samskaras are alike. These are not worldly samskaras that bring the mind down. These are samskaras that actually help you enter the state of nirbija samadhi, asamprajnata samadhi. Their function is solely to block the activation and emergence of other conventional samskaras that lie dormant in the samskaric deposit of the chitta. So that's what I render here as the samskaras generated by Rtambhara Prajna. I call them. Now notice, this is where I think I deviate to some extent from Bryant. Let's call them Rtambhara samskaras, so wisdom-bearing samskaras. They destroy all other samskaras, worldly samskaras. Okay?
So where do you differ?
We're about to see. Well, no. We're about to see. We're not there yet at the point where I kind of object to what he's doing, to what he's saying here. Okay. Then he says, when these conventional samskaras, which produce mundane thoughts and ideas, the chitta vritti, are blocked, samadhi is enhanced, says Vyasa. Samadhi, in turn, produces beneficial samskaras of wisdom or discrimination, which further block the conventional samskaras and are in turn deposited in the chitta. These then are activated and further enhance samadhi, triggering more samskaras of wisdom, and the cycle goes on. Although the more wisdom samskaras that are deposited, the more the chitta is transformed, and the more readily the yogi can enter into and maintain samadhi states. Okay, let's pause here for a second. So what he's illustrating is a kind of virtuous circle. It's a circle in which these Rtambhara samskaras block our ordinary samskaras, thereby leading to, we're coming much closer to the ultimate goal of chitta vritti nirodha, the cessation of all chitta vrittis, mental fluctuations. That enhances our ability to remain in the state of samadhi. The longer we stay in the state of samadhi, the more wisdom samskaras are generated. I'm talking now about just still this nirvichara state of sampragyata samadhi. Okay, so it's this virtuous circle. Okay. Now, the final sentence is where I start to quibble / disagree with what Brian's doing here. He says, these beneficial samskaras, nirodha samskaras, have been compared to a thorn used to extract another thorn, which are then both discarded. Okay, now, as far as I can tell, these beneficial samskaras means what? Rtambhara samskaras. Now, Brian is calling those samskaras nirodha samskaras. Nirodha samskaras. Okay? I know. So we'll get to it in a second. Now the thing is, I think that, at least according to Vyasa, and I think this just makes more sense logically too, and I think Swamiji also agrees, Swami Vivekananda, is that Nirodha samskaras are generated in the next stage. And in this next stage of Nirbija Samadhi, these Nirodha samskaras are the ones that block the Rtambhara samskaras. So we need to distinguish between Rtambhara samskaras on the one hand and the Nirodha samskaras on the other. We don't want to acquaint them. And in fact, sometimes, as far as I can tell, Bryant himself distinguishes them, which makes it more confusing. On my end, maybe I'm missing something, but I think what Bryant is doing here is confusing because he seems to be equating Rtambhara samskaras with Nirodha samskaras. And then he ends up saying that Nirodha samskaras block the Rtambhara samskaras. We'll see, but these are also defined as Nirodha samskaras. So it gets kind of weird. We'll see more specifically later. Okay, but then he says, this bottom of page 164. Nirbija Samadhi is different from the Asmita stage of Sabija Samadhi discussed in 1.17. So he's explaining how this Asamprajnata Samadhi is different from a particular stage of Samprajnata Samadhi. In the latter, so this stage of Samprajnata Samadhi, the consciousness of the Purusha is still emanating out and being channeled through Chitta. The Chitta is still involved in the state. Because Chitta is so pure in this state, the commentators compare it to a luminous mirror in which Purusha can see its own reflection. But Purusha is not seeing itself directly. It becomes aware of itself indirectly by seeing a reflection of itself through the medium of Chitta. So it's describing the difference. This is at the Sampragyanta stage. In Nirbija Samadhi, the consciousness of Purusha is not radiating out and aware of itself as a reflection in Chitta, because the Chitta has uncoupled itself completely from Purusha, who can now remain purely self-absorbed, that is, no longer aware of Prakriti at all. So now Chitta and Purusha are completely decoupled. They're completely separate from each other, which is not the case in Sampragyanta Samadhi. Of course, we end up with the same problem that I raised toward the beginning of our class, which is Purusha was never actually coupled with Prakriti, with the Chitta, right? Because by definition, the Purusha is eternally liberated, Nitya Mukta. And so you get this question, and it'll come up, I think, pretty acutely in the commentary on the last sutra. What exactly is the point of all this? Who is the one getting liberated? Okay, we'll get to it, but all right. Now, next paragraph, 165, page 165. Again, the same kind of, I think, confusion in Bryant's commentary comes in. So let's read this carefully. He says, the term nirbija, seedless, indicates that this state is not related to any object that can plant a samskaric seed in the chitta, not even the Nirodha samskara of the last sutra. Okay? So he's clearly equating the Rtambhara Prajna, Rtambhara samskara with Nirodha samskara. Okay? Then he says, it therefore does not leave any record of itself in the chitta. The existence of the Nirodha samskaras can therefore be inferred, says Vyasa, only by the lapse of time in the Nirodha state. You don't actually perceive the Nirodha samskaras because you have no consciousness in that state, no external consciousness, and you're not even aware of the mind because there's no subject-object duality in that state. But when you come out of the state of samadhi, you can infer that there were these blocking samskaras, these Nirodha samskaras. Okay. Okay, bottom of 165. Vijnana Bhikshu sees the eradication of all discriminatory or truth-bearing samskaras during nirbija or asamprajnata samadhi to be a gradual process, which explains how a yogi can enter into the nirbija samadhi state and then return to discriminatory consciousness. The total elimination of all such wisdom samskaras is not instantaneous. Okay, so it's a gradual process, and the longer you stay in the stage of nirbija samadhi, asamprajnata samadhi, the more these nirodha samskaras are able to destroy the remaining Rtambhara samskaras. Okay. Then he says, when they reactivate, one is thrust back into external prakritic consciousness. They meaning these wisdom samskaras. According to Vijnana Bhikshu, only when the very last samskaras born of sabija, samprajnata samadhi, are eradicated by the series of nirodha samskaras born of nirbija, asamprajnata samadhi, does one enter fully into the nirbija state permanently. This points to the death of the physical frame. There thus appears to be a progression even within nirbija. So there seems to be kind of stages even within this. Even though the Yoga Sutra itself doesn't distinguish stages in the way that it does with Samprajnata Samadhi, with the 6 stages, there does seem to be a progression, culminating in what? Death, which sounds kind of bleak. But this is celebrated by yogis. They call it videha mukti. Good riddance to this body, and thank God I don't have to come back again. Or if there's a God, we don't know. In yoga, all bets are off. So, okay. So this is a serious question. Is Jivan Mukti possible in the philosophy of yoga? Big question. Many different views on this. There's vigorous debate among scholars about whether Jivan Mukti is even possible. There's a parallel debate in classical Advaita Vedanta about this. And classical Advaitins themselves, like Madhusudana Saraswati and others, they say that Jivan Mukti, strictly speaking, is not possible. You can't be fully liberated while in the physical body. So they posit what's called avidya lesha, a trace of ignorance, even in the Jivan Mukta. Okay, Lance Nelson has an excellent article on this. So I think there's a similar problem here. So long as we have a physical body, we haven't reached the highest goal because we're still somehow involved with Prakriti in some sense. We're stuck in this body, right? In our truth, the truth is we're just Purusha, completely separate from Prakriti. But so long as we are in the body, we don't have the full liberation. That's at least one mainstream understanding. And that's why, and we'll see this when we get to the final. How did I skip to? I didn't read, this is weird. I didn't have you guys read 1.51 together, did we? Oh, but I started reading the commentary. Oh, sorry. So sorry for jumping the gun on that. Please repeat after me. So now I'm going to just read the sutra, 1.51. I got overexcited. Tasyapi nirodhe sarva nirodhan nirbijaha samadhihi. Okay. Upon the cessation of even those truth-bearing samskaras, nirbija samadhi, seedless meditative absorption, ensues. This makes a lot more sense now that I'm reading this. I just jumped right ahead. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay. So I think this is further evidence that, and Vyasa I think makes this very clear, that the samskaras referred to in the state of Rtambhara Prajna are Rtambhara samskaras. These are beneficial samskaras, okay? That would be like the second thorn. But the final thorn, to remove both those thorns, the bad samskaras and then finally the Rtambhara samskaras themselves, you need the thorn of Nirodha, the Nirodha samskaras, which is ultimately self-canceling. That's the way I see it. Again, there's a similarity in classical Advaita Vedanta. There's what's called akhandakara vritti, which is, it's a thought of Brahman, which ultimately cancels itself. It consumes itself. Swamiji used a beautiful phrase to explain it: fire eating fire. And then there are no samskaras left. There are no thoughts at all. So I see Nirodha samskaras in this final sutra, in the stage of Asamprajnata Samadhi, as doing the same thing. They first destroy all the remaining wisdom-bearing samskaras, the Rtambhara samskaras, and then they destroy themselves. They say sayonara, and then what's left is the Purusha. Yeah, you have a question? Can you give the mic to her? To Katyayani?
Okay, just a quick question. I have to stop you with the whole thorn thing.
Yep.
So wait, if the first thorn is ignorance, wait, what's the point of a second thorn in your 3 thorn analogy? Can you...
This is thorn 2.
But what does that do if it doesn't remove the thorn? It just takes you... It's that state.
No, you use the second thorn to remove the first thorn.
But then you're still stuck with the second thorn.
Yeah.
So you still have a thorn.
Yeah, and then that's why...
But it's a better thorn.
Samskaras.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, now, we should read, because I skipped this page, we need to read the beginning of his commentary. So this is page 164. Commentary on 1.51. It's a very interesting commentary. Bryant says, we now come to the end of the road of the yogic process outlined by Patanjali. In Nirbija, seedless samadhi, explains Vyasa, both the illumined insight and discernment born in Sabija samadhi and the truth-bearing wisdom samskaras that accompany it are themselves rendered inactive. Okay? Even these are destroyed. Vyasa notes that the Nirodha samskaras of 1.50, the restraining or suppressing samskaras, block or even eliminate even these beneficial truth-bearing samskaras of discrimination. In the ensuing state of Nirbija Samadhi, the yogi's awareness has no contact whatsoever with Prakriti, external reality, either in its gross or subtle aspects. In other words, the chitta is not focused on any aspect of an object, gross or subtle. Completely uncoupled from chitta, all mental and cognitive processes, Purusha is now aware simply of itself. There is a samskara that facilitates this by suppressing all samskaras whatsoever, including those of insight and wisdom. This is the Nirodha samskara, as its name suggests, the ultimate samskara that produces absolute chitta vritti nirodha. All thought is now latent, sarva nirodhan. So it seems to me that a clearer way to explain this, if Bryant were consistent, would be not to call Rtambhara samskaras Nirodha samskaras at all, but to wait until the next sutra, when it's describing Asamprajnata Samadhi, to talk about the Nirodha samskaras, because we need to keep these separate. It's the Nirodha samskaras in the stage of Asamprajnata Samadhi that block and ultimately destroy the Rtambhara samskaras in the stage of Rtambhara Prajna, which is the 6th and final stage of Samprajnata Samadhi. Okay, so I think we do need to conceptually distinguish Rtambhara samskaras from Nirodha samskaras, and I think he kind of muddies the waters. Okay. Okay. So now, back to 166. He says, to summarize, Vyasa is suggesting here that for such a total state of internal absorption to occur, there must be a certain type of samskara, the Nirodha samskara, that blocks all cognitive functioning of the chitta, even the hitherto beneficial faculty of pure insight and discrimination. You like this? What do you like about it?
It means that maybe I'm not senile. My chitta is being blocked.
Well, there you go. Oh! That's one way of looking at it. Okay. Discrimination, after all, is a function of the mind, which produces a samskara that discriminates between Prakriti and Purusha. So by definition, the mind at this point is still engaged in functioning within the contours of Prakriti and therefore actively engaging awareness to this extent. So even in this very high stage, there's still some kind of discrimination going on between Purusha and Prakriti. And that also requires vrittis, which ultimately have to be eliminated, which can only happen in this final stage of Asamprajnata Samadhi. Okay. He half-jokingly says, he calls these Nirodha samskaras the Terminator samskaras, like the movie Terminator, because they destroy everything, finally. Okay, there's a really interesting paragraph in here where he refers to Hariharananda Āraṇya, one part of Hariharananda's commentary on this sutra. It's on page 167, so I'll read that. And there are interesting parallels with the Bodhisattva idea in Buddhism and the Vijnani ideal in our own tradition, Ramakrishna. Despite this, Hariharananda states that some yogis, wishing to do good to humanity, can enter nirbija for a specified time, so this highest stage of samadhi, and then later reactivate their minds so as to be able to function in the world for the benefit of others. This is something akin to the Bodhisattva of Mahayana Buddhism, who postpones irrevocably entering nirvana out of compassion for all other embodied beings left suffering in samsara. To do this, it would seem that prior to entering the state of nirbija samadhi, such a yogi would have to intentionally deposit a samskara in his or her chitta to activate later as a thought that will pull the awareness of the yogi away from total absorption in the self and back into external consciousness, mediated by the chitta. A type of samskaric alarm clock arousing the yogi from samadhi. This is I like the language here. And it reminds me of a few things in Sri Ramakrishna's life. One of them, this is more from a bhakti kind of a standpoint, but when he's in this state of nirvikalpa samadhi, after he does this advaitic sadhana under Totapuri, he's about to leave his body in a way, right? But then one sadhu comes, whacks him over the head with a stick and forces some food down his throat, some milk or something. And then he says, Divine Mother herself told me, bhave thako, bhavmukhe thako, stay in the state of bhavamukha, which I take to be a kind of synonym for vijnana, this threshold state of spiritual consciousness between Brahman and the Leela of Shakti, this cosmic Leela of Shakti. Okay. And then another thing that it reminds me of is you'll find this in the gospel a lot. When Sri Ramakrishna goes in these very high states of samadhi, when he comes down, he says things like, Ami jal khabo, I want a glass of water. I want a sweet, like a sandesh or something like that. He like artificially creates a desire in his mind to bring the mind down. Okay, now Hariharananda Āraṇya, in his commentary, he explains this process actually. He says, even when such power of arresting the mind is acquired, so when he's fully capable of leaving the body in the state of Asamprajnata Samadhi, Videha Mukti, he chooses not to. The yogin who wants to do good to humanity with a nirmana chitta, Nirmana, a nirmana chitta, translated as a constructed mind. You literally construct a mind for the purposes of helping others. He says, the yogin who wants to do good to humanity with a nirmana chitta, a constructed mind, arrests the mind for a specified time, and his mind rises after that period as a constructed mind. He chooses to come back from this final stage of samadhi to help others. It has been stated before that in the opinion of the yoga school, Ishvara arrests the mind for a cycle and at the end of it favors his devotees with supreme knowledge and thus liberates them. So, interestingly, yoga philosophy does seem to leave scope for a kind of bodhisattva or vijnani kind of ideal. And philosophically, they have to defend this idea of a nirmana chitta, that this realized soul will actually construct a mind in order to come back from the stage of samadhi so that it doesn't leave the physical body. Because if you leave the physical body, you can't help others, right? That's the idea. And unlike in classical Advaita, this world is real in Sankhya and Yoga. And so these people are actually suffering, right? Or are they? So now we get to the final paragraph here. Oh, actually, no, there are a couple things. So let's read the last two paragraphs of the commentary. So this is page 167, and we'll read carefully the last two paragraphs. Vyasa continues that when one fully enters into nirbija samadhi, the highest stage of samadhi, the mind, along with all the beneficial samskaras that were produced during sabija samadhi, dissolves into its primary matrix, the undifferentiated prakriti. This is really important. And what exactly is meant here? This is Vyasa, the first commentator. The mind itself, the chitta, dissolves back into prakriti, the unmanifest prakriti. To me, that suggests videha mukti again. It's the mind itself disintegrating into, dissolving into the elements, the five elements, as far as I can tell. Or videha, V-I-D-E-H-A. It means disembodiment. It's the opposite of jivan mukti, which is liberation while still in the physical body, right? Okay, so then he says, the Nirodha samskaras that allow this, Vachaspati Mishra notes, do not provide the mind with a raison d'etre, a reason for being. They do not perpetuate the mind's very reason to exist, as even the Sabija samskaras do by providing discriminating wisdom. So even in this stage, the mind has a reason to exist. It's to produce these Rtambhara samskaras, these beneficial samskaras. But in this stage, there's really no purpose that the mind serves. Okay. Vachaspati Mishra points to 2.18, which informs us that the mind exists solely to accomplish either of two functions: to provide material experience of samsara, or to lead the soul to liberation. Now that the latter has been achieved, this person has achieved liberation, in Nirbija Samadhi, the mind, along with the beneficial truth-bearing wisdom samskaras that have brought it to this point, ceases all action. The mind, therefore, now unemployed, dissolves back into its matrix, prakriti, as a clay pot, once its function has been accomplished, is discarded and dissolves back into the earth. Then, as Ramananda Saraswati puts it, where there is no cause, there is no effect. Samsara ceases. Again, I think this language strongly suggests videha mukti, that you leave the physical body. Okay, then he says, now, says Vyasa, the Purusha, one thing I wanted to mention about this whole idea of the chitta in this highest stage of samadhi ultimately dissolving back into prakriti, the term used later in the Yoga Sutra is pratiprasava. Pratiprasava. It means kind of like devolving back into the causal matrix of prakriti. Okay? One of my old PhD students when I was at Vivekananda University in India, in Belumat, his name is Shushanta Bhattacharya. He wrote an article which is going to be published very soon in Journal of Indian Philosophy, which I helped him with, where he talks about, analyzes in great detail, this concept of pratiprasava in yoga, in the Yoga Sutras. And he discusses the scholarly debates about this concept. And different scholars have different interpretations. And two of the main ones are what are called the epistemological interpretation and the ontological interpretation of pratiprasava. Okay, this process of the mind dissolving back into Prakriti. The ontological interpretation is the one that says that it really amounts to leaving the physical body. Right? For the chitta to dissolve into Prakriti means that you're leaving the physical body. Okay. The epistemological interpretation actually accepts Jivan Mukti. You were asking about Jivan Mukti. These are contemporary scholars of the Yoga Sutras who are claiming or trying to argue that Jivan Mukti is possible. And then what they do is they give a kind of a different kind of interpretation of the state of pratiprasava, the state of chitta dissolving back into prakriti. They say that's not physical dissolution of the body, but you should take it kind of metaphorically. That you're no longer, the purusha is completely decoupled from prakriti in this sense. But that doesn't mean you have to leave the physical body. It means that you don't identify with the body anymore. So who cares about the body? Something along those lines. It gets more complicated. If you're interested, it should be coming out in a few weeks, that article, and you can look at it, or I can post it in the YouTube description, the link to it. Okay, so I'm just flagging that. We'll eventually get to this concept of pratiprasava later in the Yoga Sutras, and we can talk about that in more detail. Final paragraph. Now, says Vyasa, the Purusha can exist in its own right. Notice the length. So this is very interesting. I mean, this immediately raises red flags for me. But anyway, now, says Vyasa, the Purusha can exist in its own right, free, pure, and completely detached, as if it wasn't before. And he admits that it was always that way. But anyway, okay. Actually, says Vijnana Bhikshu, it has always been free. Very next sentence. Literally, this is Brian now. You thought I was teasing him, but he says it. Actually, says Vijnana Bhikshu, it has always been free. Notions of freedom and bondage in relation to the Purusha are figurative conventions of scripture. Samsara and all it entails exists in the mind, not in the Purusha itself. The Purusha becomes apparently ensnared in samsara by dint of the mind erroneously misidentifying with it. And because of this identification, Purusha apparently becomes ensnared with the universe of experiences that the mind presents to it. But now in Nirbija Samadhi, all vestiges of association with the chitta have been discontinued, and the final and ultimate goal of yoga has been attained. Purusha's unmediated absorption in its own conscious, eternal, essential nature. Therefore, says Vyasa, in this state, one refers to the free Purusha as the, quote, the pure, Shuddha, the self-contained, Kevala, and the liberated, Mukta. And then Bryant says, last sentence, his own commentary, actually it has been that way all along. Now I'm throwing up my hands here because what do we do with this? So the Purusha is eternally liberated. It doesn't need any of this stuff that we're doing. It doesn't care whether we're liberated or bound. The mind, right? Prakriti. Because it has nothing to do with Prakriti. It never had anything to do with Prakriti. So it's not Purusha that's seeking liberation. Purusha is not the kind of thing that could ever be subject to delusion or ignorance. It never mistakenly identifies with the mind. And then you might say, yeah, well, fine. So it's the mind, right, that's seeking liberation. But the mind is non-conscious. It's strictly insentient. So it's as insentient as a stone. What does it mean for a stone to be bound or a stone to seek liberation? So both the options seem to me to be problematic here. Who benefits from attaining the state of Asamprajnata Samadhi, Nirbija Samadhi? Not Purusha. Purusha is eternally liberated. And the mind is insentient. So it doesn't have anything to gain. It actually dissolves into Prakriti. That's the final. So it's a kind of suicide. It's committing suicide. So how is that? So what's left? We only in Sankhya philosophy, the Sankhyan metaphysics, which yoga philosophy is based on, there's only Purusha on the one hand and Prakriti on the other. There's no third category. Vedanta has a way out because it posits what's called a jiva, an individual soul, right? And they say that it's the jiva, it's the individual soul, that eternal individual soul that's bound, that feels bound, and that it seeks liberation. But yoga philosophy doesn't have a category of jiva. It doesn't seem to, at least explicitly, right? Because where does it fit? On the Prakriti side, on the Purusha side, or somehow straddling one foot in each camp? Something like that? But how is that possible? Because Purusha and Prakriti are not supposed to be combined or in any way. They can't be conjoined. Now, Hariharananda Āraṇya, I talked about this before, but he actually claims that we have to posit a jiva. And it is a kind of mixture of Purusha and Prakriti. And then he says, really interestingly, now he kind of waxes Shankarite in a way. He goes, and in the state of final liberation, the jiva realizes it never existed. It was a phantom entity. It was a ghost all along. So again, it's a kind of suicide. I mean, it's a very interesting, I think this is a very serious question to ask ourselves.
We're in there somewhere.
We should be, but where are we?
There's this us.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And that's what Hariharananda Āraṇya calls the jiva, right? And my challenge to yoga philosophy is, where does the jiva fit within the metaphysical framework of Sankhya Yoga? I can't figure it out. Maybe I'm just stupid. So any of you, if you can figure it out, tell me where the jiva fits within the Sankhya Yoga metaphysical framework. Purusha is eternally liberated. It doesn't need any of this. It's perfectly content as it is, right? And then Prakriti is just insentient matter. That's all it is. Whether it's grossly physical matter, like these physical bodies, or the subtly physical mind, the chitta. But it's as insentient as a stone. It's not conscious at all. And so how can that be the kind of thing that is bound, that strives for liberation? All those things suggest consciousness. And yet there is no conscious entity that is bound or needs liberation, as far as I can tell. Any thoughts on this? This is pretty heavy stuff, but
it seems.
Yeah. Can you give him? Could you wait for the mic, please? Yeah.
It's just more of an intuition, but it seems to be in the moment. It seems to be in this when we're trying to figure it out, or just being with this. That's where I have a sense of that. And just to be clear, so jiva is like the soul is another
individual soul.
Individual soul.
Yeah. Let me read you something that Hariharananda Āraṇya says about this. This is quite interesting. He says, he asks this question directly because he's concerned by this problem. And he goes, who attains liberation? That very one who feels suffering is the one who attains liberation from suffering. So it's kind of like what you're asking. Huh? Yeah. Who attains liberation? Hariharananda Āraṇya asks. that very one who feels suffering is the one who attains liberation from suffering. My experience is that I suffer. Therefore, I am the one who attains liberation. Okay. So this is actually very similar. If any of you have studied Shankara's commentaries, Shankara in his commentary on the Gita, he asks the same question. Well, who exactly is bound? And he says, the one who's asking the question. Which, exactly, but at the same time, that's, you know, the way that Daniel Ingalls is a scholar who has an article on this, on Shankara's answer to this question of whose is avidya. And he says, this is not philosophically satisfying, but it's pedagogically effective. And I would say the same thing about that in this context too. It's philosophically, it's like almost a non-answer, right? It's not actually explaining where the jiva, the individual soul, fits within the metaphysical framework of Sankhya Yoga. Pedagogically, it means like, well, for us struggling spiritual aspirants, it can get the job done, maybe, arguably. At the same time, I do feel like in Buddhism, for instance, there's the Noble Eightfold Path, and that the first factor is samyak drishti. You should have a clear understanding, a right worldview, a right view, a right understanding of things. You should have clarity about the nature of reality, what's the goal, how do I get to my goal? And I'm stuck on this because I don't have a clear sense of what the purpose of sadhana is from a Sankhya Yoga standpoint. No, by definition they can't, and they don't, right? Because Purusha is eternally liberated and separate.
But we don't know that until we get there. We think we're here, we think we're this.
Can you give her the mic just so that? Oh, okay, she doesn't want it. I'll so go ahead and say it, and I'll summarize it. Yeah.
Until we actually get to the end and realize that we don't exist, when there is no suffering, while we're in this state of we're in the mind and in our senses, that's what needs the liberation. But when we get to the end, that doesn't exist. We're not
Right.
that.
We're Purusha.
Liberation.
There is no liberation, is that what we said?
Yeah, because we're already liberated. There is no.
Right. There's no being that is liberated or gets liberated. Because we think we're bound, right? Yeah, but actually we're not. It's kind of like Ashtavakra Samhita, that, you know, the book that Sri Ramakrishna kept with him and that he had Naren read, his beloved Swami Vivekananda. Muktabhimani mukto hi baddho baddhabhimanyapi. The person who thinks he's liberated becomes liberated. The person who thinks he's bound will always be bound. Yeah, Leela, can you give the mic to Leela?
I'm just thinking we're getting stuck on the idea of there being an actual container, or that there is the actual thought process itself is the container that needs a sense of movement through the concept of the Shita. Maybe in the end we really are talking about the Nirmana Sukta, as we were originally suggesting, a container of a sort that holds the moving thought process.
Yeah, but that can't apply to ordinary people, because that's a very high state people like bodhisattvas who want to serve mankind.
But it still has a context of ego and I-ness to it that's tied to it. So that is what actually makes the movement toward needing a liberation from being bound.
Yeah, okay, so the Nirmana Chitta itself is purely on the side of Prakriti. But the I-ness behind it is borrowed from the Purusha side. So then they'll use these metaphors like Purusha illuminates Prakriti. Purusha illuminates Chitta and makes it seem as if it's conscious.
But that's your straddling of the fence right there.
This is what?
But that's your straddling of the fence right there.
It should be, but straddling is not allowed. No straddling. It's one of the rules in Sankhya Yoga. As far as I can tell, metaphysically straddling is not possible. But maybe I'm just misunderstanding it. Yeah, can you pass the mic all the way down here? Thank you.
So I'm trying to put all this together, and it kind of makes sense if you want to be in the state where you realize this is a game or an experience. So when you're doing the samadhi, you know, what you talked about in the beginning, where you go outside of the personal perspective, like you actually can see yourself and you can see atoms. So you're tapping into that higher consciousness while you're in a body, then you come back into the body. But then as you progress, if you go into that state, that seems like a prerequisite for creating the constructed mind, where a person could go into samadhi, release their body, but then construct a mind only because they've seen through to the atoms. So if you're addicted to the body and then you just reincarnate because you think you're this soul that's going from one body to another, that's one journey. But then this seems like a different journey where while you're in this body, you experience, like really, you don't read about it. You experience the whole. And then when you release the body, you can actually construct a mind or construct a body and come back, but you do it consciously. And that seems to tie into, what we hear in the scriptures about the yogi attains can exist without birth or death. It's like you're not just being born and dying, but you're choosing to come in and out. And this is actually in a lot of spiritual disciplines, this state where you can be here, but instead of believing that you're here and you're trapped, you see the body as this really amazing opportunity.
Right.
So when you drop the body, it's not like this disgusting body. It's like, thank you, body.
Be grateful to it.
You
Yeah, or something.
anchored me here while I could see that perspective.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just trying to put it all together in my head because it's very similar to other traditions that I've studied.
Right.
And I guess I'm putting this together and saying it to like ask you, does this make sense to you, or does this?
I don't want to say yes. I'll just say that it's a possibility.
Uh-huh.
It sounds like you're leaning more toward the what I was calling the epistemological interpretation of pratiprasava, and that jivan mukti is possible. It's possible to be liberated while still in the physical body. My own leanings are probably toward the ontological interpretation. I'm thinking that in yoga you have to actually leave the physical body for the final liberation. That's my own hunch, but again, it's open to different interpretations.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But what of a state of liberation where you come back by choice? I mean, have you read?
What I read from Āraṇya. He's saying you create a constructed mind.
Yeah.
Nirmana-citta.
Well, like the Tibetan book of the dead.
But yeah, I know. But the thing is, I think even there, some of the classical yoga philosophers will explain that there's still some residue of ignorance that accounts for that remaining karma. So I wanted to finish one more thing here before we end the class, which is these three types of karma. This is mentioned bottom of page 163. This is Bryant's commentary on 1.50. Okay. Vijnana Bhikshu states the Sankhya and Vedantic view here. The wisdom-bearing samskaras destroy only the dormant and unmanifest store of karma. This is the first kind of karma. It's called sanchita karma. Okay. And not the prarabdha karma, the second kind, the karma that has already activated. Karma exists in various stages, the exact specifications of which differ from school to school. But essentially it lies dormant, awaiting later fructification. Sanchita karma, so that's the first kind, sanchita karma. Or is being accumulated by ongoing activity under ignorance in the present, sanchiyamana. And this is the third kind of karma, otherwise called, I think more commonly understood as agami karma. This is karma that will fructify in the future, not in this lifetime, or at least not now. Okay. And then, or it has already been activated and is now manifest. That's the second kind, prarabdha karma. Samadhi then destroys all the dormant karma, that's number one. However, the already activated karma of the yogi's present experience, meaning prarabdha karma, lifespan, type of body, ongoing happenings, etc., is terminated only upon the manifestation of the nirbija samadhi, the subject of the next sutra. So Vijnana Bhikshu is saying here that when we attain this stage of Rtambhara Prajna, we eliminate all of our sanchita karma other than prarabdha karma. And we eliminate all the karma that would have fructified in a future life, but we won't have any future lives, and so that also is destroyed. Prarabdha karma is typically understood as a subset of sanchita karma. It's the store of all our past karma that is already activated and that we have to live out in this life. And so the idea seems to be that when we finally attain the state of Asamprajnata samadhi, we're finally able to exhaust our prarabdha karma, and we can accelerate the process through which this prarabdha karma is eliminated. So long as, that's why in classical Advaita, we talked about this before, there are 3 stages of samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi. In the first stage, your own karma forces you to come back to this world. In the second stage, so Brahmavid Variyan and Brahmavid Varishtha. Second stage, you enter the stage of samadhi, you don't come back on your own, but if somebody whispers a certain mantra into your ear, you come down. And in the third and final stage, you leave the body in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi. So likewise, in the highest state of samadhi, in yoga as well, it seems to me that once you exhaust your prarabdha karma, there's nothing that can bring you back into the physical body. Unless you create a nirmana chitta. But then, another way of putting that is, if you create this constructed mind, you're deliberately keeping a little bit of prarabdha karma in order to serve humanity.
So you're choosing to.
You're choosing to, definitely. Yeah, exactly.
At that time where you're saying, I'm going to.
Yeah, you're choosing to, absolutely.
My choice.
Yeah.
It's not a trap.
No, of course, you're choosing to. Yeah, absolutely.
Makes sense with what I was saying.
Yeah, no, I agree with that part of what you're saying. Yeah, I think that's right, yeah. The question is, that's not full jivan mukti. I think even yoga philosophy will say that's not full jivan mukti. You know what I mean? Because you're deliberately preventing yourself from going into that final state of liberation in order to serve humanity. That's why the bodhisattvas say, I forego my own nirvana in order to serve others. Well, maybe, yeah, you can call it like a more sattvic desire, a very spiritual desire, something like that. But yeah, something that's driving that constructed mind and keeps it going, right? Sri Ramakrishna would pray to Divine Mother to keep a veil of Maya over Swami Vivekananda's eyes. Because if it weren't there, then he would just leave his body, right? It's kind of similar in that way, I think. Okay, any final questions or thoughts on this? Heavy stuff? Wild stuff. And then we're going to get into, do you agree that there's something, I find Brian confusing on this whole Rtambhara samskara, how he kind of sometimes equates that with Nirodha samskara. Did that make sense to you? Why I think they should be kept separate? Okay, I'm glad you agree. Yeah, can you give the mic to Adya?
Perhaps Nirodha Samskara can be understood in the context of like a relatively, like if it's cancelling something out, it's a Nirodha Samskara.
Yeah, right, but not in the ultimate sense. I was thinking,
Yeah.
but then he should have said that. Like, he's using the same term. He could say the relatively Nirodha Samskaras, or like the relative Nirodha Samskaras, and then the terminator ultimate Nirodha
Yeah, are those Nirodha Samskaras then in the last stage, are they actually Samskaras or are they, what, like...
I think they are, but that this is something that Brian doesn't explicitly talk about, but I take it that it's implied. They cancel themselves. Fire eating fire, that's the way that Swamiji...
But samskara means like something that leaves an impression.
Right.
So how, in what
No,
sense
it's not
are
that it
they?
leaves an impression. It is an impression.
It is
Yeah.
it's a movement.
It's a latent mental
Or
impression.
it's a movement.
It's a latent mental impression. So it's an impression that will ultimately consume itself. I think that's the idea.
Like an anti-samskara.
Yeah. A samskara that commits suicide, ultimately. Yeah. Yeah, you want to get the mic to Leela?
But it's a wisdom that prompts expansion, right?
Expansion in what sense? What do you mean by that?
A movement toward further dissolution, further integration, further...
Well, yeah, I don't know about expansion and integration, but towards the final goal of kaivalya, which is realization of yourself as Purusha.
Because these are the type of samskaras that eventually get broken down by Nirodha samskara. Yeah? So
Yeah, but what she's asking is what happens to those Nirodha samskaras themselves?
themselves.
And I
okay.
think what's implied is they consume themselves, or they destroy themselves, or they dissipate in some way.
Okay, all right.
In the stage of samadhi, in this highest state of samadhi, even those Nirodha samskaras are ultimately destroyed. That's when Sri Ramakrishna touched him early on, and then he sees everything swirling.
And then it's
What's the
swirled back
swirling here? What's the connection?
I think of it as one is the samskaras, I can think of it as pravritti nivritti, or like in one way like samskaras that are generating the world, and then when they swirl back in the other direction, samskaras that
That's
are
an interesting,
like
creative way of thinking about pravritti.
dissolution, some samskaras, dissolution.
Yeah, or an unwinding or something.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, thank you. All right, thank you everyone. See you next Thursday. We're going to come down to earth next Thursday. We're going to talk about concrete spiritual practices, Kriya Yoga. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Tuesday and Wednesday are gospel classes. Oh wait, sorry. Did I make a mistake here? Oh, the Yoga Sutra classes, the recording has stopped, huh? What did I say? Oops. Oh no. The Yoga Sutra class is in two weeks from now.